Hello, my name is Beth Dixon, and these are some short podcasts on how to use your calculator for some very specific applications. And this podcast will be on how to use your calculator to graph a line. Now, we're not going to be discussing lines, but more how to use your calculator to graph a line. So if you're having difficulty with lines themselves, then you'll want to look at our podcast for equations of a line and to give you some more information. This one is specifically for the calculator and how to put a line into the calculator and what the calculator can do for you to help you with that. And as such, let's turn our calculator on. Let me clear out what I've put in, and that was just to clear. And we'll talk more about that. And anytime that you're in the y equals mode, to get out of it, clear will not get you out of that mode and out of that menu. So to get out of this menu, you should always hit the second button, which is blue on my TI-84, which may be yellow on your TI-83 calculator, and some of the other calculators may be a different color, but they're color coded so that second button, and then right next to it is the mode button, and above that is the word quit. So we'll hit quit, and that gets us out of that screen and back to what we call our home screen, where we normally do most of our operations, our adding, subtracting, multiplying, and such. I'm going to clear that out because that's nothing to do with what we're going to do here. Now, to begin our graphing, let's take our first example. Pull that example out. And we wish to graph the line y equals x plus 2. So we're going to take our calculator. I'm going to pull it down a little bit because we're not going to be using our number keys quite as much, so I'll pull it down just slightly. We're going to press y equals, which is right here. And again, that pulls this menu back up. And we have a list of y equations. And I'd like for you to arrow down. And let's just make sure, as we're starting out, that these are all clear. One of the things that will cause errors is for there to be something in those that we didn't intend. Another thing that can cause errors is for one of these plots to be on. See where it says plot 1, plot 2, or plot 3. And in our case, we don't need any of those plots on. If those plots are on, how do we tell they're on? They're on if they're highlighted. Okay, now I went on and turned it on. How did I turn it on? I went up there and put the little flashing light, Mr. Blinky, as it's been called by someone, on top of it, and then I pressed enter, and that turns it on. I put Mr. Blinky on top of it and press enter, and that will turn it off. All I'm doing is pressing enter when the cursor is on top of it, and that turns it back off. So if you've got one of those on, let's go on and turn it off. Those are common mistakes or common errors, not necessarily mistakes, excuse me, that's probably a bad word, but those are common things that the calculator will give you errors for, and students come in, my calculator won't graph. Well, those are common places for it to give errors. And students say, oh, I can't graph, my calculator won't graph. And those are places and first things that I check is to see if you've got a plot on. And then what's happening is the calculator is trying to graph a plot where there's nothing to plot. So let's just make sure all of those are off and that everything's clear. Once you've done that, generally they won't turn themselves back on. You know, sometimes our kids get into the calculators, or we accidentally press buttons when they're in the book bag or something. So that occasionally happens. So if you get those errors, go check those places. Let's go back to our equation, which is y equals x plus 2. And we're just going to type that in. There's our y equals. We're going to put it in y1. And we're going to type in x. And the easiest way to get to x is to type in the x that's located next to the alpha key. Now we could press alpha and then come down here to the alpha that's down here as a green key and type alpha x, but it's just easier to press that one key that represents the x. So this key right here is our x, then plus 2. And we've typed in the expression x plus 2. Now, we can press enter or we don't have to because we're done at this point. And if we want to look at the graph, we can then press graph. Now, my graph is set to the standard window. If your window does not look like this, it's an easy fix. Press the word zoom. And even if it is, press the word zoom anyway for the practice. And we've got certain zooms that we can use. And as your teacher needs you to learn about these, you'll go through these. And the one that we want is the zoom standard, which is Z standard, which is number 6. And we order by number or re-arrow down and press enter. And I just press the number 6. And that gets it to a standard window. And a standard window on the calculator is 10 up, 10 down, 10 to the left, and 10 to the right. And I'm not going to go into any more about the window. I'm going to do that on a separate podcast. Now, I want to graph this line. Now, I could look down and try to count these little tick marks. And those of you with good eyesight probably can. I don't have good eyesight. My arms need to be longer as I get older, and I can't see these tick marks. I can get a general idea that this slope is going up as I read from left to right, which tells me it's positive slope, and that it's increasing as I go from left to right. But that's about all I can see, and I can see that it crosses on the y-axis on the positive, and I can almost see that it's on 2 tick marks up, but that's about all I can see. To get a better idea on how to translate this graph onto my graph paper, I want to use the table. And the table is in blue on my calculator. On the TI-83, it'll be in yellow, but that means I need to hit the second key and then table. And again, if you need to know more about how to use your table, watch the podcast on the table settings and how to use the table. In this case, we're going to then translate. And these are points that would make this line true. In this case, I'll go over it. On the other ones, I probably won't. But negative 2 plus 2 is 0. Or excuse me, negative 2 plus 2 gives me the y value of 0. So these are points that make this line true. These are ordered pairs. These are x's and y's such that if I pick an x value of negative 2, then y equals negative 2 plus 2, y equals 0. And it solved it for me, and it gives me those ordered pairs. So it solved it for me. So negative 2 on the x-axis and 0 is an ordered pair. The next ordered pair is negative 1, 1. Negative 1, 1. The next one is 0, 2. 0, 2. 1, 3. 1, 3. 2, 4. 2, 4. And again, I'm not talking about how to graph a line, so I didn't talk a lot about the ordered pairs here. I'm more about how to use the calculator to graph the line. And so that's how I use the table then to graph and get my ordered pairs. The ordered pairs then create my line, and I've graphed the line using my calculator, and I can compare what I've graphed to what I've got on my calculator, and they look very similar. So I have graphed my line. Let's do another one as an example. Again, to go back, we want to go to y equals. This time we do have something in it. We can either type over it or we can clear to clear it out. I'm going to press clear. I'm going to now type in negative 2, then the x, which is located next to the alpha key, subtract 1. Notice to start out, I typed in the negative key, and then in between the values, I used the subtract key. Again, I'm going to just kind of give it a glance over. Notice this time that because of the negative slope, it goes down. And then to graph my points in my ordered pairs, I'm going to graph the point -2, +3. The next ordered pair is -1, 1. 0, -1. 1, -3. And I could graph more or less ordered pairs depending on what your teacher says. And I really should use a straight edge to graph these. To be honest, I didn't bring one into the podcast room, so I don't have a straight edge. So that's what I'm going to do to graph these. And again, this is about how to use the calculator. If you want to know how to graph and more about the lines, you want to watch the ones that are more on the lines and about slope and how the lines work. This is about the calculator. Okay, let's look at another example that involves a fraction and how the calculator will handle the fraction. Okay, again, to get back, we'll go to y equals, clear out what we have. In this one, we want to graph 1/2 x plus 3. There are places that our fractions need parentheses and places they don't. If in doubt, put parentheses, which is 1 divide 2 parentheses. This happens to be one place where we don't need parentheses, and I tend not to put them in here. But it does make it look more like a fraction to put it in the parentheses, plus 3. And the other reason why I wanted to do this one as a fraction is because I wanted to show you, even though in our picture we can't tell much difference, we can see that it's flatter and not as steep as the other two lines. But when we go to our table, second table, to get our points, that we'll suddenly have, and I hope you can see that well, and I may try to telescope in just a little bit. Sometimes it telescopes in and sometimes it will not. And that's not wanting to. But as you can see, some of my points are fractions. So my first point ordered pair in my list is the number -2, 2, which is a good point to graph. -2, +2. The next one on my list is -1, 2.5. That's not a good one to graph. I don't want to try to estimate that one. So I'm going to skip it. And I'm going to go to 0, 3. There's nothing to say that I have to use every point that's in the table. So I can just go to 0, 3 as my next point. The next one is 1, 3 1/2. Again, I don't like that one. It has a fraction in it. So I'm going to skip it and go to the point 2, 4. 2, 4. Skip the 3 and go to 4, 5. Now, if I don't feel like I've got enough points, I can always arrow up or down to get more points. And right there's a nice one, -4, 1. -4, 1. Ah, there's -6, 0. And I still don't have any negative points, so if I want to go back one more, there's one more back. I can go -8, -1, and I finally have a negative value so that I have some negative and some positives. And I have positive and negative values. And this is a case where when you have fractions, that the calculator will give you answers in fraction form. But to avoid the fractions, we just go and pick the whole number answers. Notice something about my whole number answers. 2, 0, 2, 4. They're all multiples of 2. 6 is a multiple of 2. 2 goes into 6, and we get an even answer. 7, 2 does not go into 7 evenly, and we get a fraction answer. 8 is divisible by 2. We get an even answer. 9 is not divisible by 2. We do not get an even answer. So as long as we're choosing multiples of 2, we'll get an even answer. And so the calculator will let us pick out those nice answers that are easy to graph, because whole numbers are always easier to graph because our graph is divided into whole numbers. To graph the halves, we would be in between. And again, that gets more into we're kind of leaning away from the calculator there, so we'll stop right there and do our last example. Our last example here is just to show you that we can graph more than one line at a time. We can graph 2 lines at a time. And so at this point, we'll go back to our y equals, hit clear. Our first one is x minus 1. There's the x. Remember, the subtract is always between 1. And I'm just going to press enter to get to the next one. This time I'm not going to use parentheses, -2 divide 3x, just to show you that it does work both ways. So whichever preference you have as to whether to put parentheses when you're graphing or not to put parentheses when you're graphing, then subtract 6. Now, when I press graph, I'll get both lines. The first one graphed is always y1. The second one graphed is always your y2. Now, the table can be a little confusing. So let's look and see what the table shows us. This table shows the x values in the first column. Okay? Y1, we put in the first one, which was x minus 1. So x and y. So we've got 3, 2. Whoops, I went over there and had lots of positive values. So I'm going to come over here and get back some negative values. But I'm just going to go backwards this time because it doesn't really matter. 2, 1, 1, 0, 0, -1, -1, -2, -2, -3, -3, -4. Okay, and that's our first line. I'm just ignoring this. Let me put it back over here. Sorry about that. And I'm just ignoring the Y2s over here because this and this are the ordered pair. The first column and the second column make a list of ordered pairs. So I'm going to graph the point 3, 2, the point 2, 1, 1, 0, 0, -1, -1, -2, -2, -3, and -3, -4. And that is y equals x minus 1. And because we're going to have two lines there, I'm also going to label that one. Now my other line is y equals -2x 2/3 x minus 6. In this case, trying to situate this so you can see everything, I'm going to ignore the middle column. The middle column is the y's for the first line, but I still need the x's, and I'm going to go from -3 to +3. So I'm going to go on and write those x's down, but I'm going to use the y values over here. Now the reason why I'm going so far is because notice on this one, there's lots of fractions. -3 gives me -4. -2, -1 gives me fractions, but 0 gives me -6. -1, excuse me, +1 and +2 gives me fractions, but 3 gives me -8. Wow, those are all negative values. Let's see if I can get some positive values by going a little bit further up. Now notice it wouldn't go further up when I was on the y equals. So how do I go up? I go back over to the x values and go up. And since I don't have room where the way I've written, I can just extend my table down below because the order doesn't really matter. And I see, oh, wait a minute, here's another whole number. There's a whole number. I'm just looking in the table for a whole number. And that's -2. So I've got -6, -2. Oh, there's another whole number. -9, 0. So those are the only numbers I have that will fit on my chart, because my chart is limited by the size that I have. So let's graph the points I have. I have the point -3, 4. I have the point 0, -6. I have the point 3, -8, which is off my chart, but we'll estimate it there. I have the point -6, -2, and -9, 0. So it's all negative, but it fits on my chart. And I'm going to turn my line around, my paper around, because I can draw my line better, left to right. And there we go. We have both of my lines on my graph. And in this case, I can even see that they cross here at -3, -4. And I have a nice crossing point that I can actually see very clearly when I drew my points. And I can also see that on my table, because they're at -3, they both have a y value of -4. Again, this was more about using the calculator than graphing the lines. So if you need some help with graphing the lines, just go back and look at those. And it was kind of long, but graphing lines and graphing equations of all types is a very important concept. So I wanted to be sure to cover quite a bit so that you could get lots of practice on it and practice looking at the table and then translating those, as well as how to ignore the fractions and then looking at more than one equation as we do that. I hope this was helpful. If you need some additional help, be sure to stop by room 222 in the Math and Behavioral Social Science building, and we'll be glad to give you some additional help. Thank you.